The moment Roy Hudson rode into Coldwater Creek, Nebraska, in the spring of 1882, he had every intention of marrying a woman he had never met, and absolutely no idea that fate had already decided he would fall in love with her sister instead. The letter had arrived at his ranch 3 weeks prior, carried by a post rider who smelled of tobacco and horse sweat, and who had asked no questions about the sealed envelope he delivered. The letter was from a man named Gerald Rourke, a homesteader who had built something decent out of the cracked, red earth of the Nebraska panhandle. The arrangement was straightforward and businesslike, the way most arrangements between men of modest means tended to be in those days. Roy Hudson had good land, 80 acres of it along the Platte River, but no wife, no hands to help him work the spring planting, and a loneliness that had started to settle into his bones like cold weather settles into old timber. Gerald Rourke had a daughter of marrying age, a woman named Clara who by all accounts was sensible and willing, and Gerald Rourke needed a son-in-law with means enough to keep his family from being swallowed whole by debt. Roy was 26 years old and practical about most things. He had dark hair that curled at the ends when it grew too long and brown eyes the color of creek water after a good rain. He was tall enough that door frames sometimes required his attention, and he had the hands of a man who worked rough-palmed, scarred across the knuckles, but gentle when they needed to be. He had agreed to the arrangement the same way he agreed to most difficult things, with a steady exhale, a square of his shoulders, and the quiet belief that a man could build affection if he first built respect. The town of Coldwater Creek sat along the southern bend of a shallow river that had given it its name. It was a proper enough town for 1882, not the lawless kind you heard stories about from men who had been to Dodge or Tombstone. It had a general store, a telegraph office, a small church painted white that had been repainted 3 times since its founding because the Nebraska winds stripped paint the way they stripped everything else without apology. There was a saloon, naturally, and a livery, and a row of modest houses that hugged the main road like fence posts. Roy arrived late in the afternoon, when the light was long and golden, and the dust from the road hung in the air like smoke. He had his good hat on and his coat brushed clean. He had rehearsed something to say. He had rehearsed it on horseback for 3 days, and it still did not feel like enough. The Rourke homestead was half a mile past the edge of town, a clapboard house that had been well cared for but was beginning to lose the argument with time. The fence needed mending. The garden had been worked hard and recently. 2 horses stood in a small pen to the side, and a rope of laundry stretched between 2 posts, shirts and skirts lifting and falling in the afternoon wind. Roy dismounted at the gate and tied his horse, a big roan gelding named Justice, to the post. He straightened his coat. He removed his hat, turned it once in his hands and put it back on. He walked to the door and knocked twice, clearly, the way his mother had taught him a man ought to knock. Not timid, not demanding, just present. The door opened and it was not Clara. He knew it was not Clara because Clara, according to her father's letter, had light hair like early wheat and was considered by most to be the prettier of the 2 daughters, a detail that had been included with the kind of blunt economy that men of that era used when discussing women as though they were listing the qualities of a breeding mare. The woman who opened the door had hair the deep red-brown of old mahogany, pulled back at the neck, but escaping around her face in small curls the wind had worked loose. She was not what anyone would have described as plain, though Roy suspected some people had told her otherwise, because she carried herself with the particular careful stillness of a person who has learned not to take up too much room. Her eyes were gray, not the dull gray of overcast sky, but the bright sharp gray of river stones in clear water. They went directly to his face with no hesitation and no coyness and no performance of any kind, and they assessed him the way a person assesses something they intend to make a decision about. "You are Roy Hudson," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "You are later than my father expected." The road through the creek crossing was washed out. "I came the long way," She considered this. That was sensible, she said, as though she was keeping score. Are you Clara? He asked, though he already knew she was not. Something moved across her face, not pain exactly, but something adjacent to it, something quick that she tucked back before he could properly see it. No, she said. I am Esther. Clara is my sister. Come inside, Mr. Hudson. My father is in from the field. That was that. Roy did not understand it then. He stepped over the threshold of the Rourke house, and he sat down at the table where Gerald Rourke poured him coffee and talked about the land and the debt and the arrangement. And Roy answered all the right things. And Clara came down from upstairs smiling in the careful way of a young woman doing her best to be appealing to a stranger. And Roy smiled back at her because it was the right thing to do. But some part of him, some quiet, stubborn, unreasonable part of him, had stayed at the front door. Clara Rourke was everything her father's letter had promised. She was 22 years old and fair-haired, and she had a pleasant laugh that she used strategically and opinions about things that she was careful to deliver softly, so they did not inconvenience anyone. She was not a bad woman. She was simply a woman who had been raised to orbit the preferences of others the way planets orbit the sun, and she did it gracefully and without apparent resentment, and Roy recognized in her someone who had been taught to make herself agreeable above all else. Esther, he noticed over supper, did not do this. Esther Rourke was 24 years old, and she had a directness that she made no effort to sand down, and she had opinions that she delivered at their full weight without wrapping them in apology first, and she moved through her own house with the ease of someone who belonged to it completely. She served the meal and took her seat, and when Gerald Rourke said something about the spring planting that Roy thought was factually incorrect, something about the drainage on the eastern field, Esther said, quietly but without equivocation, "That is not right, Papa. The drainage runs south. You told me so yourself when you dug it." Gerald Rourke looked at her the way a man looks at a woman who has spoken plainly in a room full of people, and there was irritation in it, but there was also the faint defeat of a man who knows he has been caught. "It may be," he said. Roy looked at his coffee. He was smiling, and he did not want anyone to see it. He stayed that first night in the barn, which was where any decent man would expect to stay before a marriage had been formalized, and he lay on his back in the hay and stared up at the dark rafters and tried to sort out what exactly was happening inside his chest. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was the strangeness of the situation, the oddness of meeting a family you were about to marry into. He told himself he was a practical man, and practical men did not get sideways over a pair of gray eyes and a woman who corrected her father's geography at the dinner table. He almost believed himself. In the morning, he was up before dawn, as was his custom. He was in the yard working the pump handle to wash his face when the back door of the house opened, and Esther came out carrying a bucket for the chickens. And she stopped when she saw him, and they looked at each other in the thin blue light before sunrise, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You rise early," she said finally. "Habit," he said. "From the ranch, the animals do not consult anyone's preferences about the time." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh, but she turned away before he could be sure. She went to the chicken coop, and he watched her without trying to watch her, the way a man watches something that has caught his attention whether he intends it to or not. "Mr. Hudson," she said, with her back still to him as she tended the chickens. "Roy," he said. She paused. "Roy," she said, as though she was testing the weight of it, "you should know something about my sister. All right." She turned then and faced him, and in the pre-dawn gray her expression was serious and unguarded and completely honest. "Clara is a good woman," she said. "She will be a good wife if you are a good husband. But she does not love you. She cannot love you yet. She is frightened of all of this, though she will not say so, because she has been taught that the shape of her future is not hers to decide. I am telling you this because I think you are a man who deserves to know what he is walking into." Roy set down the cloth he had been using and looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone ought to," she said simply. He held her gaze for a long moment. The sky had gone from blue-black to the pale gold of early morning, and it lit her face from the side and turned the loose curls at her temple to copper. "What about you?" he heard himself say. "What has she been taught about your future?" She blinked, and it was the first time he had seen her thrown, the first brief window into something beneath the composure. "That is not relevant," she said. "I think it might be," he said. She picked up her bucket and went back inside without answering, and Roy stood in the yard in the growing light and understood that he was in a great deal of trouble. The following days were a study in restraint on both their parts. Gerald Rourke was eager to move the arrangement along. He talked about dates and contracts and the business of it, and Roy listened and nodded in the right places, and all the while he was painfully, acutely aware of Esther's presence in every room she entered and every room she left. She did not seek him out. She was not flirtatious. Indeed, she seemed to make a deliberate effort not to be anything with him at all, as though she had identified the particular danger of the situation and had decided to manage it by removing herself from it as much as the confines of a small house would allow. Clara, for her part, was trying. Roy could see that, and he appreciated it. She asked him questions about his ranch, and she listened to the answers with real attention, and once she laughed at something he said, genuinely, not strategically, and for a moment he thought, perhaps this is enough. Perhaps a man can build a good life on respect and shared purpose and the honest effort of two decent people. But then Esther would come through the room with a basket of mending or a book she had borrowed from the Reverend's wife, and something in Roy's chest would shift the way a compass needle shifts when iron passes close, and he would know that what he was thinking was not quite true. It was on the fourth day that things changed. Gerald Rourke had ridden into town for supplies, and Clara had gone with him, partly to see her friend Margaret Hobbs, who lived above the milliner's shop, and partly, Roy suspected, to have a few hours away from the awkwardness of the arrangement. Roy had stayed at the homestead because there was a section of the fence that he had noticed needed mending, and he had the tools and the knowledge, and a man sitting idle when there was work to be done was not something his upbringing would permit. He was working on the fence, sweat-damp and coat-off in the afternoon sun, when he heard the sound from the barn, a sharp crack followed by a low, pained cry that was unmistakably human. He was across the yard in seconds. Esther was on the ground of the barn, one hand gripping her ankle, her expression tight with pain and the particular fury of a person who is angry at themselves for being hurt. A broken rung from the hayloft ladder lay on the ground beside her, the old wood rotten through. She had clearly been climbing up, and the rung had given way. "Do not say anything," she said before he could open his mouth. He did not say anything. He knelt beside her and reached for her ankle with both hands, and she went very still, the way a person goes still when they are trying hard not to react to a touch they were not expecting. He felt along the bone carefully, the way his father had taught him to do with injured animals, not that he said so. "It is not broken," he said. "Turned badly, you need to stay off it." "I cannot stay off it, I have work to do. The work will still be there tomorrow." "You do not know my work," she said, with enough edge in it that he looked up at her face. She was still tight with pain, but her eyes were bright and irritated and directed at something beyond him. "What were you getting from the loft?" He asked. A pause. "A box," she said. "My mother's things. Papa will not look at them, and Clara does not want to, and someone has to sort through them eventually, and I thought if I did it quietly." She stopped. "It does not matter. Your mother has passed 4 years ago." He held her gaze. "I am sorry," he said. She looked at him then, and whatever calculation she had been doing, the careful arithmetic of how much of herself to show and how much to withhold, seemed to pause for a moment. "She was remarkable," Esther said, and her voice went soft in a way he had not heard from her before. "She was the one who read to us. She was the one who argued with the schoolteacher about what girls ought to be permitted to study. She believed in things." Loudly, she stopped again as though she had said more than she intended. "That is where Clara gets her light hair," she added like she was redirecting. "From her." "And you," he said before he could stop himself. "What do you get from her?" Esther looked at him for a long, steady moment and did not answer, but something in her expression said she knew exactly what he meant and that she was not going to reach for it, not here, not with him, not when the shape of everything was still what it was. Roy helped her back to the house. She leaned on his arm, and she was warm and solid against his side, and neither of them spoke the whole way across the yard. And when she sat down at the kitchen table and reached immediately for the mending basket as though to demonstrate that she was perfectly fine, he bit down on a smile and went to make her a cold compress from the water barrel and brought it to her without being asked. And she looked at it, and then at him with an expression that was the closest thing to vulnerable he had seen on her face. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," he said. They were alone in the house for 2 hours. At first they observed the required distance of propriety, she at the table with her mending, he by the window reading the almanac Gerald Rourke had left on the sill. But at some point the quiet between them became a different kind of quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but the easy silence of two people who are comfortable in the same space, which is an entirely more dangerous thing. She asked him about his ranch. Not the way Clara asked, not with the polite interest of someone gathering information about their future, but with genuine curiosity, asking specific questions that showed she understood the practicalities of land management and livestock in ways that surprised him. "My mother taught me," she said simply, when he remarked on it. "She said a woman who knows nothing about the work has to trust blindly, and trusting blindly is a luxury we do not have out here." "She was right," he said. "Yes," Esther said, "she usually was." He told her about the ranch then, the way he had never quite managed to describe it to Clara. Not the practical facts of acreage and water rights, but the real thing, what it felt like at sunrise when the river mist was still low in the cottonwoods, and the cattle were quiet, and the whole enormous sky went pink and gold, and there was not a single thing wrong with the world. He told her about the winter he had nursed a young heifer through a bad fever, and she had made it, and how he had felt something embarrassingly close to joy about it. He told her about the loneliness too, briefly, without dressing it up, and she received it without pity and without discomfort, and that was the most unexpected thing of all. "You are not what I expected," she said at some point, not looking up from her mending. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A man who wanted a wife the way a man wants a second horse," she said. "Useful, interchangeable. And now," she looked up, "now I think you are a man who actually wanted a partner and settled on wife because that is the word available to him." She held his gaze. "That is rarer than people acknowledge." Roy Hudson, practical man, sensible man, man with a plan, looked at Esther Rourke across a kitchen table in the Nebraska Panhandle in the spring of 1882, and understood with absolute clarity that he was in love with her. Not the new kind of love that announces itself loudly, but the older kind, the kind that arrives quietly and sits down and does not intend to leave, the kind that is less a feeling than a recognition, as though something long displaced has finally found the exact shape of the place it belongs. He said nothing, because what could be said? He had come here for Clara. Gerald Rourke had arranged it for Clara. Clara herself had agreed to it, and she was not a woman who deserved to be discarded because her sister had gray eyes and her mother's spirit. When Gerald Rourke and Clara returned in the late afternoon, Roy was back at the fence and Esther was at the table with her ankle elevated, and nothing had happened that anyone could point to. But something had shifted all the same, like a river changing course underground, invisible on the surface but real in everything that follows. That evening, after supper, Clara came to him on the porch where he was sitting with his boots off and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. She sat beside him in the other chair, the one with the crooked leg, and she looked out at the darkening land and she said without preamble, "I need to tell you something, Mr. Hudson." "Roy," he said, "please." "Roy." She said it without the weight Esther had put on it, casually, like a tool she was picking up. "I do not think this arrangement is what either of us truly wants." He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed but honest in the way that people are honest when they have decided that honesty is the only route left to them. "Clara," he started. "I am not saying this to be unkind," she said quickly. "I am not saying I could not try to be a good wife to you. I would. But I know that you came in this door 4 days ago and you looked at my sister, and something happened that I recognized, because I have watched men look at Esther my whole life and then look at me as though they are choosing the safer road. There was no bitterness in it, which made it more terrible somehow. I do not want to be the safer road," she said quietly. Roy was very still. "There is a man in town," Clara said. "Benjamin Mercer. He has a shop. He repairs watches and clocks. We have been—" She hesitated. "He has intentions that Papa does not approve of because he does not have land." She paused. "But he looks at me the way I want to be looked at," she said simply, like it was the truest thing she knew. Roy set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned to look at her fully. "Have you told your father about Benjamin Mercer? Papa arranged for you to come," she said. "He would not hear it." "Would you like me to speak to him?" Roy asked. "On your behalf?" Clara turned to look at him, and her careful composure slipped just enough to show the real thing underneath. The young woman who was frightened and hopeful and tired of letting other people arrange the geography of her life. "You would do that," she said. "I would," Roy said. "And not for the reason you might think, though that reason also exists," he added honestly. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he did not expect. She reached over and covered his hand briefly with hers, not romantically but warmly, the way one decent person acknowledges another. "She will not make it easy for you," she said. "Esther, she protects herself, more than people see." "I know," Roy said. "Don't let her push you away," Clara said. "She does it when she cares the most." He thought about that for a long time after Clara went inside. The conversation with Gerald Rourke took place the next morning, and it was not easy. Gerald was a man shaped by practical necessity and 30 years of doing what had to be done, and the idea of an arrangement being dissolved was to him not simply a disappointment but a kind of structural failure, as though the beams of the house were shifting. Roy sat across from him at the kitchen table. Esther was outside, wisely, tending the garden with her ankle wrapped tight, and he laid it out plainly. He said that he had come with honest intentions and would not speak ill of those intentions, but that he had learned things in the past several days that made it plain to him that the match between himself and Clara was not one that would make either of them content, let alone happy, and that he believed a man named Benjamin Mercer deserved a conversation. Gerald's face went through several things in sequence. Anger first, real anger, the kind that comes from a man who feels the ground shifting under him. Then something more complicated. Then, slowly, the particular defeat of a man who already knows the thing he is being told. "Benjamin Mercer is a good enough man," Gerald said finally, grudgingly, "but he has no land." "He has a trade," Roy said, "and in 10 years Coldwater Creek is going to be twice the size it is now. A man who fixes what is broken in a growing town is not a man without prospects." Gerald looked at his hands on the table. "And you," he said, "why are you sitting here talking to me about Benjamin Mercer instead of riding back to your 80 acres? Roy looked at him steadily. "Because I would like to ask your permission to court your other daughter," he said. The silence stretched long. "Esther," Gerald said. "Yes, sir." Gerald Rourke rubbed a hand over his face. He was a man in his mid-50s, weathered like old wood, with a face that had been handsome once and was now just real. "Esther is not a simple woman," he said, not unkindly. "I know," Roy said. "She has opinions. I have noticed. She will argue with you." "I look forward to it," Roy said with complete sincerity. Gerald looked at him for a long time. Then he exhaled, long and slow, the exhale of a man releasing something he had been holding. "She is the better one," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She always was. Her mother was the better one too." He was quiet for a moment. "She will not make it easy, Roy. I say that as her father." "So I have been told," Roy said. "And as I said, I look forward to it." Gerald Rourke gave his permission. It was not joyous. It was worn and a little ashamed and tangled up with a man's reckoning with the choices he had made about his daughters, but it was given, and it was genuine, and Roy received it with the gravity it deserved. Telling Esther was another matter. He found her in the garden on her knees in the turned earth despite her ankle, her hands dark with soil, a line between her brows as she worked. She knew he was there before he spoke. He could tell by the slight stiffening of her shoulders, but she did not look up. "Clara told me," Esther said before he could begin. He stopped. "What did she tell you?" "That she spoke to you last night, that you intend to speak to Papa," she dug at a root, "and that you have apparently lost your mind." Roy crouched down beside her in the dirt, his forearms on his knees at her level, close enough that she could not avoid him without actually moving away. "I talked to your father this morning," he said. She stopped moving but still did not look at him. Her jaw was tight. "Roy, I asked his permission to court you," he said. She sat back on her heels then and looked at him, and her expression was complicated and afraid and furious all at once. "You came here to marry my sister," she said, and her voice was controlled but barely. "I came here to make an arrangement," he said. "That is not the same thing, and the arrangement has changed. People do not simply change arrangements. This one did. It is not." She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked out at the garden, and he could see her working through something, sorting through all the reasons to say no and all the ways this was not proper or sensible or safe. "It is not logical," she finally said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. We have known each other 5 days. I know. You know nothing about me. I know more than you think," he said. "I know you get up before sunrise and you go straight to work without needing to work yourself up to it. I know you correct people when they are wrong because you think truth matters more than comfort. I know you keep your mother's memory by doing what she would have done, which is know everything there is to know about the world you live in. I know you laugh at things that most people would not call funny, and I know you protect yourself more than you protect anything else." He paused. "I know I have thought about you every single hour since you opened that door." Esther looked at him, and her gray eyes were very bright, brighter than he had seen them, and her hands were still in the dirt, and she was absolutely still. "This is not sensible," she said, but her voice had changed. "Esther," he said, "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking you to let me know you, properly, without either of us pretending we are not." He paused, looking for the right word. "Already halfway somewhere," he finished. She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the garden and lifted her hair, and the morning sun was full on her face, and she was magnificent, and she had no idea, which made it worse. "You will need to stay in Coldwater Creek for a time," she said at last, very careful, very precise. "You cannot court a woman from 80 miles away." "I know," he said. "I have already spoken to Mr. Abbott at the livery about a room above his stable." Something moved across her face that might, if you squinted, have been the beginning of a smile. "You were very confident," she said. "I was very hopeful," he said. She looked back at the garden. "All right," she said. It was barely above a murmur. "All right," he repeated. "All right," she said again, louder, and looked back at him, and this time the not-quite smile was undeniable. "But I am going to be difficult," she warned him. "Clara already told me," he said. She made a sound. There it was, the actual laugh, brief and real and a little startled. And then she turned back to her garden with what he suspected was an effort to recover her composure. And Roy stood up from the dirt with something enormous and warm lighting him from the inside. The courtship of Esther Rourke was, as promised, not simple. Roy took up his room above Abbott's livery, a small, clean space with one window and a cot, and a good view of Main Street. And he settled himself into the rhythms of Coldwater Creek, while Gerald Rourke quietly composed a letter to Benjamin Mercer, a development that caused Clara to spend one afternoon crying quietly in her room, and then emerge red-eyed and determined, which Roy recognized as the particular resilience of a woman who has just let herself feel something she had been not feeling for a long time. Benjamin Mercer came to Sunday supper 3 weeks later, a slim, quiet man in his late 20s with careful hands and the particular attentiveness of a man who is aware that he is being evaluated and is determined to be worthy of it. Roy liked him. Gerald Rourke was stiff and formal but not unkind. Clara sat next to Benjamin and radiated a careful happiness, the kind you hold with both hands because you are afraid of what happens if you let yourself hold it too loosely. Roy watched Esther watch all of this. She was glad for her sister. He could see it clearly, the small private smile when no one was watching, the way she squeezed Clara's hand briefly as they cleared the plates. And underneath the gladness was something older and more complicated, something Roy was beginning to understand. Esther had been managing this household and her father and her sister for 4 years since their mother died, quietly, without acknowledgement, and she had done it so well that no one had thought to ask what she wanted from her own life. He brought it up, some weeks into the courtship. On one of the evenings he had taken to sitting with her on the porch after supper, while Gerald Rourke smoked his pipe inside, and Clara walked with Benjamin Mercer in the acceptable company of the entire town's awareness. They had fallen into a habit, he and Esther, of talking in the long way, the kind of conversation that does not proceed in a straight line but spirals around things, approaching difficult centers from different angles, the way water finds its way around stone. "What did you want to be?" he asked her. Before all of it. She knew what he meant by all of it. "A school teacher," she said without hesitation. "There is a good school in Omaha. My mother had a friend who taught there." It was, she stopped and let the silence fill in what she did not finish. "It is not too late," Roy said. "It is not early," she said. "You are 24. In Nebraska in 1882, that is not early for a woman," she said with a dryness that was pure Esther. "You could still study," he said. After he stopped, because he had not said anything about after yet, not clearly, not formally, and he was aware that they were walking along a border. She looked at him sideways. "After what?" she said very carefully. Roy looked back at her. The evening light was orange, and the air smelled of the river and new grass, and the town made its quiet, ordinary sounds in the middle distance, and he thought about what his life had been before he rode into Coldwater Creek, steady, decent, sufficient, empty in the specific way that a house is empty when there is no one in it. And he thought about what it had felt like every single day for the past several weeks to walk up to this porch and see her light on in the window, and he made a decision. "I would like to talk about permanence," he said, "if you will let me." Esther set down the small book she had been not reading and looked at him fully. Her expression was the careful, serious one, the one she wore when something mattered. "I am not ready to say yes yet," she said. "I am not asking yet," he said. "I am saying I intend to ask. I want you to know that when I am still asking you to know me, you are also being asked something about the future." She was quiet for a long time. The sun finished setting and the sky went the deep indigo that comes just before dark. "I have never had anyone ask me what I want before," she said finally, so quietly he almost did not hear it. "Not about this, not about something real." "I am asking," he said. "I know," she said. I am still becoming certain about what the answer is." "Take your time," he said. She looked at him and something crossed her face, something tender and surprised, and a little bit broken open, like a door that has been stuck and has finally swung free. She did not reach for him and he did not reach for her, because they were on her father's porch and the standards of Coldwater Creek had not evolved to accommodate such things. But her hand moved on the arm of her chair and his hand was close, and for one moment the air between their hands was the most charged and significant inch of space in all of Nebraska. "Roy," she said. "Yes." "I am going to be certain soon," she said. He smiled, looking at the dark yard. "I know," he said. What broke the last of Esther's careful reserve open happened unexpectedly, as the real things tend to do. It was a Tuesday in late June, dry and very hot, the kind of heat that bleaches color from everything and makes the air above the road shimmer. Roy had ridden out to look at a piece of land east of town that a man named Haverford had been trying to sell at an exorbitant price, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because Gerald Rourke had mentioned it was adjacent to the Rourke acreage, and Roy had been thinking about things. Coming back through town, He stopped at the general store for tobacco he did not need, and he overheard two men by the feed sacks talking in the way men talk when they assume they are not being listened to. One of them was talking about Esther Rourke, and what he was saying was not kind, not violently unkind, but the casual cruelty of a man who has decided a woman is fair territory for commentary. The other man was laughing. They were saying she was too sharp-tongued for any man to want, that she had frightened off every prospect in the county, that she would die a spinster because she had never learned to hold her opinions until after she had secured a husband. Roy bought his tobacco. He paid for it. He turned around. He did not start a fight. He was not a man who resolved things with his fists when words would do. He walked over to the two men, and he stood in front of them, and he said, in a voice that carried no particular heat but had a lot of weight behind it, "I would like you to speak about Miss Rourke the way you would speak about any person you intended to show some basic courtesy. Or alternatively, I would like you to acknowledge you are speaking about the woman I intend to marry, and decide from there how you'd like the rest of this conversation to go." The two men went quiet. One of them had the grace to look genuinely embarrassed. The other one tried to hold his ground for a moment, the way men do when they are uncomfortable with the alternative, and then he also looked at his boots. Roy walked out. He did not tell Esther. He did not intend to tell Esther. He had not done it to be reported. He had done it because it was right and because something in him had needed to, with a deep and uncomplicated certainty. Esther heard anyway. Coldwater Creek was the size of a place where everything heard anything within 48 hours. Margaret Hobbs told Clara, who told no one but Esther, and Esther did not tell Roy she had heard it for 3 days. On the third day she found him at the livery, helping Abbott with a horse that had thrown a shoe, and she stood in the doorway and waited until he looked up. Her expression was the still one, the careful one, but underneath it was everything else. "I heard what you said at the general store," she said. He looked at her. "Ah," he said. "You should not have," she said. "I have been handling such talk my whole life and I do not require Esther," he said. "Defending, and it puts me in an uncomfortable position where I am expected to Esther." She stopped. "I know you can handle it yourself," he said. "I know that, and I know you have been. I am not under the impression you need me." He held her gaze steadily. "I did it because I wanted to, because someone saying those things about you felt like someone putting a hand on something that matters to me." He paused. "You matter to me. That is all it was." Esther Rourke, who did not cry in front of people and had not cried in front of anyone since her mother's funeral, pressed her lips together and breathed in very slowly through her nose. Her eyes were bright and full, and she was clearly deciding with great ferocity whether or not to let a single one of those tears fall. She did not let them fall. But she crossed the distance between them, and she took his hand in both of hers and she held it, looking up at him, and she said, "Ask me now." Roy blinked. "What?" "Ask me," she said. "The thing you said you were going to ask." He looked at her. He looked at her hands around his, the dirt under her nails and the roughness of her palms and the steadiness of her grip. He looked at her face, her bright gray eyes and the line of her jaw and the curl of red-brown hair at her temple, and he did not care that they were standing in a livery, and that old Abbott had gone very still a discreet distance away pretending to examine the horseshoe. "Esther Rourke," he said, "I would like you to marry me. Not because it is an arrangement, not because it is sensible, because I cannot think of a single thing in my life that I would not rather do with you beside me, and because you are the most honest and extraordinary person I have ever met, and because every day since you opened that door I have understood something about my own life that I did not understand before." She looked at him, and the bright in her eyes was full and real, and she said, "Yes," quietly, and then more clearly, "Yes. Yes, Roy." He reached up with his free hand and cupped the side of her face, very gently, and she turned into it slightly like a person leaning into warmth, and he kissed her carefully, briefly, completely. And from the far end of the livery old Abbott made a sound that was suspiciously like applause, and then pretended he had been coughing. The preparations for the wedding did not take long. In Coldwater Creek in 1882, weddings were practical enterprises. A ceremony at the church, a supper, a dance if there was enough goodwill among the community to organize one, and then two people went home together and began the work of building a life. Gerald Rourke, in the weeks between the engagement and the wedding, underwent a visible transformation that Roy watched with quiet respect. The man was working through something, some complicated ledger of guilt and love, and the way the years had gone, the decisions made and not made about his daughters, the 4 years since his wife's death during which he had leaned on Esther's competence so completely that he had taken her for granted in the way you take for granted the load-bearing wall. He could not undo the years of it, but he began, in the way men of that generation expressed such things through action, without ceremony, to try. He told Esther one evening that she had been as good to this family as her mother. Roy happened to be on the porch and heard it through the window, heard the low, plain words and the long silence that followed, and then Esther's voice, thick but controlled, saying, "Thank you, Papa," and the sound of a chair moving as she stood to embrace him. Roy looked at the dark yard and the stars over Nebraska and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who is watching something be made right, and thought about his mother, and thought about Esther's mother, and thought about the way women hold things together in silence while the world carries on, and felt a sharp and clarifying gratitude for the whole of it. Clara Rourke and Benjamin Mercer's courtship had, by this time, been formally acknowledged. Benjamin had come to Gerald with his hat in his hands and his trade in his pocket, and had made a case for himself that was quiet and sincere and devoid of ornamentation. And Gerald Rourke had sat across from him, the way he had sat across from Roy, and had made the same internal reckoning, and had arrived at the same conclusion, that a daughter's happiness was worth more than any number of acres he himself would never farm. The double happiness of both his daughters had softened Gerald Rourke in ways that were visible to anyone who looked. He was not transformed into a different man. He was still the same worn, practical, taciturn man who had worked himself down to the bone on that Nebraska homestead for 30 years, but there was something lighter in him, something that had been clenched unclenching slowly, like a fist deciding to become a hand. Reverend Caldwell married Roy Hudson and Esther Rourke on a Saturday morning in early August 1882, in the white church that had been repainted 3 times, with every window open because the summer heat was considerable, and propriety had its limits. The whole of Coldwater Creek was in attendance or close to it, because the story of the arrangement and the rearrangement had circulated in the way stories circulate in small towns, not maliciously, but with the warm interest of people in each other's lives. Clara stood beside Esther. She had made Esther's dress herself, pale blue cotton with small white buttons at the cuff, because she was handy with a needle in a way Esther was not, and she had taken a private joy in the making of it. She was crying quietly from happiness, with no attempt to manage the tears, and Benjamin Mercer in the front pew with Gerald Rourke was watching her with the expression of a man who knows exactly what he has in front of him. Esther walked down the aisle on her father's arm. She was not traditionally bridal. There was no veil, no practiced demure gaze. She walked the way she walked everywhere, straight and steady, and she looked directly at Roy the entire way, her gray eyes clear and certain, and his entirely without reservation. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his life, and he told her so afterward privately, and she said, "You are biased," and he said, "Completely," and she laughed with her whole face, and he thought, "This is what the rest of my life looks like," and it was not a thought that frightened him at all. They took the road out of Coldwater Creek that same afternoon, Roy and Esther, in the wagon he had come in 3 months ago with Justice tied to the back. Gerald Rourke stood at the gate of his homestead and watched them go. Clara stood beside him with Benjamin's hand in hers. Esther looked back once, just once, and only when they were far enough along the road that the looking was a choice rather than a hesitation, and she raised her hand, and Gerald Rourke raised his, and Clara waved until the wagon rounded the long bend and the homestead disappeared. Esther sat beside Roy on the wagon seat, and the Nebraska sky opened up above them, immense and cloudless and blue so deep it was almost purple at the zenith, and the road rolled out ahead of them into the long country, and the cottonwoods along the river threw shade across the track in shifting patterns. "Are you frightened?" he asked her. "No," she said. "Are you?" "A little," he admitted. She looked at him. "Good," she said. "It means you are taking it seriously." He laughed, the full kind, the unguarded kind, and she smiled at the sound of it and leaned against his shoulder, just slightly, just enough. And he adjusted his arm so it was around her instead. And she fit there as though the geometry had always been designed for exactly this. And they rode into the afternoon together, with the river flashing silver to their left, and the grass moving like water in the wind, and everything ahead of them open and enormous and entirely possible. The ranch on the Platte was 80 acres of good land that Roy had worked for 3 years alone, and it showed the particular character of a place that has been competently managed, but never quite inhabited, neat and functional and missing whatever quality turns a house into a home. Esther saw this immediately and did not say so, because she was not the kind of person who named problems before she had begun solving them. She moved through the house and the yard and the outbuildings with the same systematic eye she brought to everything, taking inventory not just of what was present, but of what was absent and what was possible, and Roy watched her do it with a pleasure he did not bother to conceal. This was her work, her specific genius, the rearrangement of the existing into the better, the recognition of what a thing needed in order to be fully itself. Within a week, she had reorganized the kitchen so that the workflow made sense. Within 2 weeks, she had identified which of the fence lines needed immediate attention and which could wait until fall, and she and Roy mended them together in the long summer evenings, while the light lasted, working side by side in a comfortable complementarity that felt to Roy like discovering a word he had always known the meaning of but never been able to use properly. She planted a kitchen garden. She started a correspondence with a woman in Omaha who ran a small lending library that mailed books by post. She introduced herself to the neighboring families, the Kowalski family 1/2 mile north, the Tanner widow 2 miles south, and was received with varying degrees of warmth which did not appear to concern her in the slightest. And she read. God, how she read! Every evening after supper she read by lamplight until her eyes wouldn't cooperate, and sometimes she read aloud to Roy from whatever had arrived in the most recent post bundle, and he would sit across from her and do whatever repair work had accumulated, mending tack, sharpening tools, and listen to her voice in the lamplight, and think that if this was what his life had narrowed down to, he was the luckiest man in Nebraska. There were hard things too, because the frontier in 1882 was not without its difficulties, and he would not pretend otherwise. The summer was dry that year, drier than anyone had hoped, and the grass in the lower fields burned off by August, and Roy spent 3 anxious weeks managing the cattle through it, moving them to the river pasture where there was still green. Esther did not panic alongside him, and she did not offer false reassurance either. She helped him work through the calculations, the cost of hay versus the cost of selling early, and her arithmetic was clean and her thinking was clear. And when the rains finally came in September, modest but sufficient, they stood together in the yard and let it fall on their faces like a reprieve. In October, a man named Sutter, who owned the quarter section adjacent to the Kowalski land, came to Roy with an offer to buy 10 acres of the Plattside pasture at a number that was fair, but not what the land was worth. Roy was tempted. They needed the cash for winter, but Esther, when he brought it home and spread it out on the table, looked at the numbers and looked at the map of the land and said, "Roy, if you sell that 10 acres, you lose river access for the east pasture." He looked at it again. She was right. Without that strip, the cattle in the east pasture had a 3-mile walk to the nearest water. "What do we do about the winter expenses?" he said. "We sell 4 of the older steers now, at market price," she said. "It is not as much, but it keeps the land whole, and in 3 years the difference in the land's value will be worth more than twice what Sutter is offering." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because land along rivers is worth more every year this territory grows," she said. "And it is growing." She said it with the matter-of-fact certainty she brought to most things, and he nodded, and they sold the steers, and Sutter bought land elsewhere, and by spring Roy understood she had been entirely correct. Letters came regularly from Coldwater Creek. Clara wrote every 2 weeks long letters, warm and full of detail, about Benjamin's work and the town's gossip and their father's small domestic victories. Gerald Work himself wrote occasionally, in the brief clipped style of a man who had not had a lot of practice writing personal correspondence. And the letters were never long, but they had a warmth in them that grew clearer with each one, like a man learning a new skill by repetition. Benjamin Mercer and Clara were married in December, in a small ceremony because the winter was hard and travel was limited, and Roy and Esther were unable to get to Coldwater Creek for it. The roads were impossible, but Roy sent a bottle of good whiskey by post rider, and Esther sent a quilt she had spent the previous 6 weeks making. And Clara's return letter described both gifts with enough detail that it was clear the quilt had made her cry, and that Benjamin had appreciated the whiskey with professional sincerity. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the first winter Roy Hudson did not dread. He had spent the 3 previous winters on the Platte Ranch alone, managing the weather and the animals and the long dark evenings with the practicality of a man who has nothing else to do, and the loneliness had been a weight he had grown accustomed to carrying without naming. This winter the evenings were long and the cold was hard, but the house was warm with the specific warmth of a place that is lived in 2 people's warmth. The warmth of argument and laughter and shared silence, the warmth of waking in the night to another person's breathing, the warmth of coffee made by someone who knows how you take it before you ask. He told her once, in the deep of January, watching ice crystals form on the inside of the bedroom window, a thing the house needed to address in terms of insulation. They both knew that he had not understood before her what it actually meant to not be lonely. Not the absence of solitude, which he had never minded, but the presence of someone who occupied the same interior landscape as yourself. Esther was quiet for a moment. She was on her side, facing him in the dim, and her expression in the faint gray light from the window was the open one, the one she wore when she had decided to let something be fully felt. "Roy," she said, "I have something to tell you." His heart moved. He kept his voice even. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him and held his gaze and said, "I believe we are going to need a larger garden in the spring." He looked at her. "And perhaps a second room," she added. He understood. He lay there for a moment with the knowledge settling through him, warm and enormous, like water rising slowly in a well. Then he reached for her, and she came into his arms, and she tucked her forehead against his jaw, and they lay in the cold winter dark, holding each other, while outside the Nebraska wind moved over the frozen land, and Roy Hudson felt the world transform quietly and completely. "Are you frightened?" he asked, because she had asked him once and it seemed right to ask. "Yes," she said honestly, "but not the bad kind." "Good," he said. "It means you are taking it seriously." She made a sound against his throat that was half laugh and half something else, and he held her tighter, and the night went on around them, and the land outside was cold and hard and resting, the way good land rests in winter before it gives itself again to spring. Roy wrote to Gerald Work the next day. The old man's reply arrived 3 weeks later, brief, as always, but with a sentence at the end that Roy read twice and then kept. She was always going to make something extraordinary of herself. "I am glad she found a man wise enough to know it." He showed it to Esther. She read it standing at the kitchen table, and she stood there for a long moment, and then she folded it very carefully and put it in the small wooden box she kept on the shelf where she kept her mother's things. She did not say anything about it. But that evening she made his favorite supper without occasion, and when he thanked her she said, "It is nothing," and he said nothing back, and they both knew what it was. The spring of 1883 came in with a generosity that felt like an apology from the previous dry year, long warm rains, good grass, the cottonwoods coming in full, and the river running clear, and the cattle putting on weight with pleasing efficiency. Roy hired a hand for the planting season, a quiet young man of 20 named Eli who had been working the Tanner widow's land and was grateful for steadier employment. And Eli was careful and hardworking and unobtrusive, and the work of the spring went well. Esther, in her 4th month, was still entirely herself, still up before dawn, still working the garden, still reading every evening and arguing with Roy about whatever topic the current book supplied. She did not perform frailty, and she did not accept treatment of herself as diminished, though she was sensible about her limits, and had allowed Roy to take over the heavier physical work without making a scene about it, which he recognized as a significant accommodation and treated accordingly. She had written in the fall to the school in Omaha. She had mentioned the one her mother's friend had taught at, and had received in return a letter from the headmistress that had clearly pleased her, though she had been careful about showing how much it pleased her. The headmistress had written warmly about a correspondence program for women who could not attend in person, a reading and examination program that led to a formal credential. "You should do it," Roy said, when she showed him the letter. "We cannot afford, Esther," he looked at her over the table. "We can afford it. It would take 3 years of study. All right. By the end of it the baby will be old enough to sit on your lap while you study," he said. "I have done the math." She looked at him. "You have done the math," she repeated. "I considered your situation thoroughly, and I believe the math works out in favor of you becoming what you wanted to be," he said. She looked at him for a long time, and the expression on her face was the complicated one. The one he had learned by now meant she was feeling something large and was deciding whether to let it be visible. She let it be visible. "You are a remarkable man," she said quietly. "Do you know that?" "I know that I am a man who wants his wife to be fully herself," he said. "I think those might be the same thing." She enrolled in the correspondence program in the spring. The books arrived by post in regular bundles, and she studied in the evenings when the day's work was done, and sometimes Roy found her at the kitchen table at midnight with a lamp and a book, and an expression of such focused engagement that he decided not to disturb her and went back to bed alone, and was not lonesome in the slightest, because that was her specific joy, and watching it was its own. Their son was born in August 1883, in the bedroom of the Platt Ranch, delivered by Mrs. Kowalski, who had midwifery experience and a temperament entirely suited to it. Roy sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a state of controlled panic that fooled no one, and Eli, the ranch hand, who had not been asked to stay but who could not seem to leave, kept him company by playing cards with him, which neither of them were really playing. When Mrs. Kowalski opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Hudson, and your wife is perfectly fine and would like to see you immediately," Roy nearly knocked her over getting through the door, and he would have been embarrassed about it later, except that when he came to the bed and saw Esther, tired and real and entirely magnificent, holding a small, fierce-looking, red-faced creature wrapped in the quilt her mother had made, he did not have the capacity for any feeling that was not simply joy. "He is very loud," Esther said, with enormous satisfaction. "He is," Roy agreed. "He looks like you," she said, "except redder." "He looks like himself," Roy said, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at both of them with an expression he made no effort to manage. "Has he a name?" Esther looked up at him. "I thought William," she said, "for my mother's father." "William Hudson," Roy said. She looked at the baby. "William Gerald Hudson," she said, and her voice was quiet when she said the middle name, looking at the baby with an expression that held everything love and grief and forgiveness and gratitude all at once. Roy reached over and covered her hand with his. She turned hers over and gripped his, and William Gerald Hudson slept on in the quilt, untroubled by the enormity of being loved. Gerald Rourke came to visit in October. the first time he had left Coldwater Creek in over a year, accompanied by Clara and Benjamin, who had news of their own to share, news that made Clara's eyes bright in a very particular way when she announced it, and made Gerald Work sit down heavily in the kitchen chair and produce a laugh that was also clearly a cry, which he covered by spending a great deal of time looking at and commenting on the quality of Roy's kitchen table construction. The visit lasted 5 days. On the last evening, all of them sat on the porch in the October cool and watched the stars come in over the Platte, and William, 4 months old and already with his father's dark curling hair, sat on his grandfather's lap and held Gerald Work's finger with his whole fist, and Gerald Work sat very still and looked at the baby with an expression Roy had not seen on him before, open and quiet and full of something that looked like mending. "You have made a good place here," Gerald said to both of them, to no one in particular, looking out at the river land. "We have," Esther said. "Your mother would have liked it," Gerald said. He said it simply to Esther, not as an observation but as a gift. Esther sat for a moment with it. "Yes," she said, "she would have liked it very much." They sat in the comfortable dark, all of them together, while the land made its night sounds around them, the river moving, the cattle settling, the cottonwoods breathing. The years that followed were good ones. They were not without difficulty. Good years rarely are, in that country in that time, but they were built on something solid, and the difficulties moved through them without breaking what was underneath. Roy expanded the ranch carefully, a few acres at a time, purchasing the section he had been watching from old Haverford when the old man finally retired and the price came down to earth. Esther completed her correspondence studies in 1886 and received her credential from the Omaha school and opened a small school on the ranch property. Just a room in an outbuilding Roy had fitted out with a proper wood floor and a blackboard he had ordered from a catalog, where she taught the children of the neighboring families, the Kowalskis and the Tanners, and 2 other families who had settled the land between the creeks. She taught reading and arithmetic and history and geography, and she argued persistently with any parent who thought those subjects were beyond what a child, particularly a girl child, needed, and she won most of these arguments, and the ones she did not win she won the following year when the child fell behind and came back to her anyway. She was, as her mother had been, remarkable. And as her mother had been, she was sometimes the only person in a room willing to say the thing that needed saying. Clara and Benjamin Mercer settled permanently in Coldwater Creek, where Benjamin's watch and clock repair shop had grown, as Roy had predicted, into something significant. He had taken on an apprentice and had recently been commissioned to install and maintain the town clock that had been erected in the center of Main Street, a project Benjamin described in his letters with a precision that conveyed exactly how much it meant to him. Clara had a daughter in the spring of 1884, a red-haired girl they named Anne Margaret after their mothers, and the following year a son named James, and their letters spoke of a life full and ordinary in the best way, full of small specific joys. Gerald Work lived to see his grandchildren walking. He died in the winter of 1888, in his own house, in his own bed, surrounded by what remained of his world, Clara and Benjamin on one side, Esther and Roy, who had ridden through the hard weather when the word came, on the other. He died with his hand in Esther's, because she was the one who had stayed through the night, who had sat up while Clara slept and held his hand in the dark and talked to him about his wife, about the early years when everything had been difficult and beautiful and possible all at once. They buried him beside his wife in the churchyard of the white church that had been repainted 3 times, and they stood at the grave in the cold and the wind that never stopped, and Esther was dry-eyed and straight and entirely dignified, and Roy stood behind her with his hand at her back, and when the last of the people from town had offered their condolences and moved away, she turned and put her forehead against his chest, and he held her, and she let herself be held. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said. On the drive back to the ranch, with William in the back of the wagon in a nest of blankets, he was 5 years old by then and had fallen asleep despite his intentions to the contrary. Esther reached over in the dark and took Roy's hand on the reins. He shifted the reins to one hand and held hers with the other. The Nebraska night was very cold and very clear, and the stars were everywhere. "He was proud of you," Roy said. "He said so to me once, last summer when we were at the fence." Esther was quiet. "He said you had never done anything that was not worthy of your mother," Roy said. She squeezed his hand. "Roy," she said. "Yes." "I am going to cry now," she said. "All right," he said. She cried quietly, not the restrained kind but the real kind, the kind that comes from deep and has been waiting. And he held her hand and drove the wagon and let her have it because she had earned it, and because she had been holding herself together for other people for so long that the relief of being in a space where she did not have to was itself a gift. And because he loved her not in the polite, careful way that men loved women they had arranged for, but in the deep, specific, real way that you love the person who has become the axis of your world, the person around whom every other thing in your life has organized itself, the person without whom the version of yourself you most want to be does not entirely exist. In the spring of 1889, Esther found out she was expecting again. This news was received with a joy tempered by a certain maternal fatigue. William was 6 and loud, and entirely his father's son in terms of not sitting still, and a certain mathematical concern about the school, which was operating at capacity, and would need a second teacher if Esther was going to take any time away from instruction. "I know someone," Roy said, when she laid out the problem on the kitchen table as she laid out all problems, as a map to be navigated rather than a weight to be carried. "Who?" she said. "Eli," he said. "He has been tutoring the Kowalski children on his own time. Did you know that? Mrs. Kowalski mentioned it. He reads very well and he has an aptitude for mathematics." Esther looked at him. "Eli is a ranch hand." "Eli is a young man who is working a ranch because he needed employment," Roy said. "He is 26 years old and he has been reading everything in our house that you have not hidden from him." She considered this. "He would need training," she said. "Train him," Roy said. She looked at him with an expression that was fond and exasperated and deeply satisfied all at once. "You think you have an answer for everything," she said. "I have an answer for this," he said. "The rest I figure out as I go." She leaned across the table and kissed him, briefly but with real warmth, the kind of kiss that is not for any particular occasion but simply for the fact of the person, and he caught her hand as she pulled back and held it for a moment. "Esther," he said, "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "I know the way this began," he said. "The arrangement, the fact that I came to that house for another reason. I know you never forget that, even though you never speak of it." She was very still. "I want you to know that I believe completely, without a single doubt, that everything in my life before you was simply what I was doing while I was getting to you," he said. "That is all it was." Esther held his gaze and her gray eyes were bright and full, and she said nothing for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was the quiet one, the real one. "I know," she said. "I have known for a long time." She turned his hand over and traced the scar across his knuckles with her thumb. "The day you opened that gate and walked to our door," she said, "I watched you from the window before Clara answered, before you knocked. You had your hat in your hands and you were turning it, and you looked at the door like a man who was about to do something that mattered." She paused. "And I thought, whoever is about to walk through that door is going to change something." Roy looked at her. "I did not know it would be you who changed something in me," she said. "I thought you were there for Clara, and I put the thought of you away like you put away a thing you cannot have." She looked down at their joined hands. "I did not keep it put away very well." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the rough and honest knuckles of a woman who worked, and held his mouth there for a moment, and she leaned her forehead against the side of his head, and they stayed like that in the kitchen of their own house, while the spring wind worked the cottonwoods and the river moved and the land was good and green and endlessly patient. Their daughter arrived in November 1889, during the first hard frost, delivered again by Mrs. Kowalski, who declared her the most determined infant she had assisted in 30 years, a verdict that surprised no one who had met her parents. They named her Margaret, for Clara's request and their mother's memory, and she had Esther's gray eyes from the first day, and Roy's dark hair and an expression of absolute evaluative certainty that William, at 7 years old, found deeply suspicious. "She looks like she is deciding something," he said, peering at her in the cradle. "She is," Esther said. "What is she deciding?" "Everything," Roy said from the doorway, and smiled at his wife over their children's heads. Eli became an assistant teacher at the school in the spring of 1890, which freed Esther to teach the older students and to develop the curriculum she had been carrying around in her head for years. The school grew. By 1891, it served 14 children from 6 families, and the Reverend's wife in town had begun sending her the names of families further along the river who were looking for schooling. Esther began to think about a proper building, about applying to the county for support, about what it might mean to turn a room in an outbuilding into something with a real roof and a bell. Roy supported every iteration of this plan, not from indulgence but from the clear conviction that it was the right thing for the children on the land, for the community, for his wife whose mind was one of the finest instruments he had ever encountered, and which deserved every opportunity to do the full work it was capable of. He supported it also by doing whatever needed doing. By hauling lumber for the new schoolhouse addition, by writing letters on Esther's behalf to the county authorities when the official language needed to be navigated in a particular way, by taking care of William and Margaret in the evenings when Esther had correspondence to attend to, and by making sure that at no point did the running of the household fall back entirely to her simply because she was also teaching and administrating and studying and planning. As it was everyone's household, and that was what he believed. William developed his father's love of the land and his mother's precision, which was a combination that made him, by the time he was 10, a small terrifying force of practicality and observation. He helped Roy with the cattle with genuine competence, and he read to Margaret in the evenings from whatever books his mother assigned, and he had his grandfather's stubbornness without his grandfather's bitterness, which Roy considered an outstanding outcome. Margaret, at 3 years old, was already exhibiting strong opinions about most things, which her mother encouraged and her brother tolerated with the martyred patience of a sibling. In the early summer of 1892, a decade after Roy had first ridden into Coldwater Creek with a hat in his hands and a prepared speech, and absolutely no idea what he was getting into, he and Esther rode back there together for the dedication of the new town hall, an occasion that had drawn enough of the county's families that it had become something of a celebration. Clara and Benjamin were there, and their children Anne and James, now 8 and 7 respectively, and entirely at ease with each other in the way of children who have spent their lives in the same small world. Benjamin had been asked to wind and maintain the hall's new clock, a commission he had clearly spent considerable thought on, and Clara stood beside him with the particular pride of a woman watching her husband be seen as what he actually is. Roy stood with Esther in the afternoon light of the Coldwater Creek Main Street and watched the town that had given him the best thing in his life go about the business of celebrating itself, and felt a gratitude so large and quiet it was almost indistinguishable from the air. "Do you remember," Esther said beside him, watching the children run between the adults' legs, "what you said to me the first morning? At the pump." "Habit," he said. "The animals do not consult anyone's preferences about the time." She laughed, the real one, the full one. "I thought, this man is either very dull or very comfortable in himself. Which was it?" "I decided very quickly," she said. He looked at her sideways. She was 42, no, 34. He corrected himself, always making the same error because she had always seemed to him ageless in the specific way of people who are fully themselves. And the years had settled on her gracefully, which was the only way they could settle on someone that honest. There were lines at her eyes, and she wore her hair differently now, less carefully contained, and she had a way of standing that was entirely her own, a particular combination of stillness and readiness, like a person who knows where they are in the world. "Esther," he said. "Yes. If I had not come to that house, if Clara had been the one who opened the door," she turned to look at him. "I think I would have known anyway," he said. "Eventually, I think I would have found my way to you." She looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes clear and certain and full of 10 years of real life. The difficult and the beautiful and the ordinary and the extraordinary all mixed together the way they are in any life worth living. "I know," she said. "I think I would have let you," she added, which from Esther was a thing that had taken 10 years to earn, and he knew it, and it meant everything. He took her hand, and they stood in the afternoon light, while the town moved around them and the children chased each other through the grass, and Clara caught his eye from across the way and smiled the smile of a woman who had known, 10 years ago, what she was doing when she went out onto the porch and said what needed to be said. And he raised his chin at her in acknowledgement, and Clara turned back to Benjamin and took his arm with the ease of a woman who has been the right place for a long time. The drive back to the ranch that evening was long and golden, the same road, the same river, the same enormous sky that had always been there and always would be, unchanged in the specific way that essential things do not change. William slept in the back of the wagon with Margaret's head on his shoulder, both of them exhausted from a day of people and noise and celebration. Justice, older now and gray around the muzzle but still a good horse, pulled the wagon with the steady authority of an animal who knows the way home without being told. Esther leaned against Roy's shoulder. His arm was around her. The stars were beginning over the river valley. "Roy," she said. "Yes. I want to ask you something." "Ask." "Are you happy?" she said. He thought about it, not because he did not know the answer, but because she deserved the full answer, the considered one, the one that gave the question its real weight. "Yes," he said. "Not the easy kind, the real kind, the kind that knows what it costs to get here." She was quiet for a moment. He felt her breathe. "Good," she said. "So am I." The wagon moved on through the dark, through the cottonwood shadows and the river's sound, through the enormous quiet of the Nebraska night, the particular quiet of a land that is vast and old and does not concern itself with any individual life, but which holds all of them, all the same, in its great indifferent grace. Roy Hudson held the reins with one hand and held his wife with the other, and ahead of them the ranch was lit and warm and waiting. The garden and the school and the cattle, and the 2 rooms they had added, and the books on every surface, and the marks where the children's heights had been tracked on the kitchen doorframe since William was old enough to stand, all of it waiting, all of it theirs, all of it a life built one careful and deliberate and lovingly argued over day at a time. He had come to a door with a rehearsed speech and practical intentions and nothing else, and the wrong person had opened it. That was what he told William once, years later, when his son was old enough to ask how things had come to be the way they were. He told him, "I came to the door with one plan and life had a different one. And the difference between the plan I made and the plan life made was your mother." And William, who had his mother's eyes and his father's patience and the particular seriousness of a young man who is not afraid of large things, said, "Was that frightening?" And Roy said, "It was the best thing I was ever afraid of. That was the truth of it. The plain, real, unsentimental truth of it. That a man can make all the right arrangements and still, if he is lucky, find that the door opens onto something better than he planned. And that the thing which changes a life is rarely the thing you came looking for. It is the thing that looks back at you when the door swings wide, clear-eyed and honest and entirely itself, and changes the whole equation without trying. Esther Rourke had opened a door. And that, as she herself might have said with one of her particular small, precise smiles, was that.